The coffee mug shattered against the pine stump when my hands finally stopped trembling. And I remember thinking that was strange. I'd held that mug steady through 4 grisly relocations in Montana and a charging moose incident near Fairbanks. But now a campfire story had broken something fundamental inside me. The ceramic pieces reflected the dying fire like scattered teeth, and Marcus was already crying in the Land Rover behind me, and somewhere out in the Wisconsin pines. Brett Calloway was not coming back. Sergeant Nina Delacroix stood beside me with her service weapon still drawn toward nothing, and the question I keep asking myself, the one that wakes me at 3 a.m. even now, is simple. Did telling the story summon the thing, or had it been listening the entire time, waiting for someone to describe it accurately before it revealed itself? My name is Delia Vance. I'm 34 years old, and for 11 years I worked as a wildlife biologist specializing in large carnivore behavior for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I've darted black bears from helicopters, tracked wolf packs through January blizzards, and once spent 6 weeks documenting a mountain lion that had wandered impossibly far from its normal range. I mention these credentials not to impress you, but because they explain why I was so stubbornly certain, for so long, that what we encountered in the Pine Barrens that October weekend had to have a rational explanation. My entire career was built on the principle that animals, even dangerous ones, behave according to observable patterns. Predators hunt. Prey flees. The food chain operates on mathematics, not malice. I was wrong about all of it, and that wrongness cost a man his life and shattered my understanding of what shares this world with us. The trip was Brett Calloway's idea, which should have been my first warning. I'd known Brett for about 8 months. We'd met at a wildlife photography workshop in Madison where he'd been the loudest participant, constantly interrupting the instructor to mention his YouTube channel and his 3.2 million subscribers who tune in for authentic wilderness content. Brett was 28, trust-funded, and possessed the particular brand of confidence that comes from never facing real consequences. His adventure blog, Calloway Explores, featured him doing moderately risky things in expensive gear while his videographer, Marcus Chin, made it all look more dangerous than it was. Marcus was the opposite of Brett in almost every way, quiet, competent, perpetually exhausted by his employer's demands. I'd shared a few beers with Marcus at the workshop after party, and he'd confided that he was saving money to quit and start his own documentary production company. 2 more years, he'd said. Then I'm done filming this idiot pretending to survive things. I should have listened to my instincts about Brett. Instead, when he called me in September proposing a cryptid hunting expedition to the northern Wisconsin Pine Barrens, I let scientific curiosity override common sense. His pitch was compelling in its absurdity. He wanted to film an episode debunking the Wisconsin Dogman legend, and he needed a credentialed wildlife expert to explain, on camera, why the creature couldn't possibly exist. Think of it as public education, he'd said. You'll reach more people in one video than you would in 50 academic papers. The money he offered didn't hurt either, $3,000 for a weekend's work, which was more than I made in a month at the DNR. I said yes. The 4th member of our group was Sergeant Nina Delacroix, a corrections officer from Green Bay who'd taken vacation time specifically to serve as our security consultant. Nina was Brett's idea of liability insurance, a fit, competent woman in her early 40s who carried a Glock 19 and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately made me like her. She'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to corrections, and she had the kind of quiet watchfulness that made you feel simultaneously safer and more aware of potential dangers. When we met at the staging area outside Mercer, she'd assessed me with a single glance and apparently decided I was acceptable. You actually know what you're doing out here? She'd asked. I told her I did. She'd nodded once. Good. That makes 2 of us. We drove north in Brett's 2019 Land Rover Defender, A vehicle he'd modified with enough auxiliary lights and roof racks to make it look like something from a post-apocalyptic film. Marcus sat in the back with his camera equipment, already filming establishing shots through the window as the landscape shifted from dairy farms to pine forests. The radio crackled with static as we passed through dead zones, occasionally catching fragments of WKPN 92.7. The Pine, playing classic rock between weather advisories. I watched the trees thicken around us, their branches interlocking overhead until the road became a tunnel of green and brown. October in northern Wisconsin has a particular quality of light, something golden and dying, as if the sun knows it's losing its grip on the world. The air through my cracked window smelled like decomposing leaves and approaching cold. Brett talked almost continuously during the 3-hour drive, explaining his vision for the episode. He wanted atmospheric footage, campfire testimonials, and then a scientific debunking, where I would explain how the Dogman legends were misidentifications of wolves, bears, or humans in costume. The believers get their spooky content, the skeptics get their rational explanation, and everyone clicks the video, he said. It's perfect. I asked him if he actually believed in the Dogman. He'd laughed. I believe in engagement metrics, he said. What I personally think doesn't matter. Nina, sitting beside me in the back seat, had caught my eye and raised one eyebrow. Neither of us said anything, but the shared glance communicated enough. Our campsite was located on private land that Brett had rented from an elderly farmer named Kowalczyk, who met us at the gate with a rusted key and a handshake that felt like it wanted to communicate something beyond greeting. He was pushing 80, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors, and when Brett explained what we were doing, something shifted in his expression. You're hunting the skunk, he said, using a word I didn't recognize. The old people called it the skunk, before the Germans came and gave it their name. I asked him what skunk meant. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too many seasons, and his answer was simple. The thing that wears the wrong skin. Then he'd handed over the key and driven away without another word. The campsite itself was beautiful in a desolate way, a clearing about 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by dense pine forest, with a fire ring of blackened stones at its center, and an old deer stand visible and a massive oak at the eastern edge. We set up our tents as the afternoon light began to fail, and I found myself enjoying the familiar rhythms of outdoor work. Marcus proved surprisingly competent with camp setup, moving efficiently between tasks while Brett filmed himself arriving in the wilderness from multiple angles. Nina established a perimeter walk, circling the clearing with her hand never far from her holster. Habit, she explained when she caught me watching. Not expecting trouble. Just always knowing where the exits are. Dinner was freeze-dried beef stroganoff and camp coffee, consumed around a fire that crackled with pine resin and sent sparks spiraling toward the darkening sky. The temperature had dropped maybe 15 degrees since sunset, and we'd all pulled on additional layers. Marcus had positioned 2 cameras to capture the fire and our faces, the red recording lights blinking like mechanical eyes. Brett was in his element now, the firelight making him look handsomer and more serious than he actually was. Okay, he said, clapping his hands together. Who wants to start with the scary stories? I'd assumed this would be Brett's domain, the showman taking center stage, but he surprised me by deferring to Nina. You've probably got the best material, he said. All those years working with society's worst. Must have heard some wild stuff. Nina shook her head slowly, her face unreadable in the shifting light. I don't tell stories from work, she said. Bad luck. Brett pressed her, but she refused, and eventually he turned to Marcus. Come on, Chin. Give us something good. Marcus set down his coffee and stared into the flames for a long moment. He was a small man, Korean-American, with intelligent eyes and the kind of forgettable face that probably helped him blend into backgrounds while filming. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. I grew up in Michigan, he said. Upper Peninsula. Town called Germfask, Look it up, it's real. About 200 people, middle of nowhere, surrounded by swamp and forest. When I was 12, my grandfather told me about the Dogman. He paused, and I saw Brett gesture subtly to check that the cameras were rolling. Marcus didn't seem to notice. He said the Dogman wasn't a single creature. It was a role. Like a job. He said the forest chooses something. Could be a wolf, could be a man, could be something in between, and that thing becomes the Dogman. Its job is to maintain the border. To make sure people remember that some places don't belong to us. The fire popped loudly, and I flinched before I could stop myself. Nina's hand had moved to her hip, an unconscious reflex. Only Brett seemed unaffected, leaning forward with theatrical interest. So what does it look like? He asked. Give us the scary details. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost like recitation. 7 feet tall when it stands upright, he said. Covered in fur the color of dead leaves, not gray, not brown, but that in-between shade you see in October. Its hands are wrong. They have fingers like a person, but the nails are black and curved like fishhooks. Its face is the worst part. It looks like someone started with a wolf and then stretched it, pulled the muzzle longer, pushed the eyes too far apart. And its mouth has too many teeth. Rows of them, going back into its throat, like a shark. But the teeth aren't the scary part. He met my eyes across the fire. The scary part is the voice. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the October air. What about the voice? Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. It learns how to talk, he said. Not like a parrot, it doesn't just repeat sounds. It listens to people, and it learns their voices. My grandfather said his father heard it once, back in 1934. He was hunting alone, about 2 miles from their cabin, and he heard his wife calling his name. She was asking him to come home, saying dinner was ready. But his wife was dead. She died of influenza 6 months before. He ran all the way home, and the next morning, he found tracks outside the cabin. Not wolf tracks. Not human tracks. Something in between. The forest had gone completely silent around us. I realized this slowly, the absence of sound creeping into my awareness like cold water. No insects. No owls. Not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of wind through pine needles. Nina had noticed too. I could see her scanning the tree line, her posture shifting from relaxed to alert. Brett, oblivious, was still focused on the story. That's great content, he said. Really atmospheric. Delia, you want to give us the scientific counterpoint now? I opened my mouth to respond with my prepared explanation about pareidolia and apex predator misidentification, but something stopped me. The wrongness of the silence had settled into my bones, triggering professional instincts I'd developed over years of fieldwork. When the forest goes quiet like that, it means something is nearby. Something that makes prey animals freeze and stop making noise. I held up one hand, cutting off Brett's next sentence. Everyone stop talking, I said quietly. Something's wrong. Nina was already on her feet, the Glock appearing in her hand with practiced smoothness. Marcus reached for his camera, then thought better of it, and stayed still. Only Brett seemed annoyed by the interruption. Come on, we're in the middle of a shoot, shut up. Nina's voice was soft but carried absolute authority. Listen. We listened. The fire crackled. The wind whispered. And then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, I heard something that made my entire body go cold. A voice. A woman's voice, faint but distinct, calling out a single word. Marcus. The sound wasn't coming from any of us. It came from the eastern edge of the clearing, near the old deer stand, maybe 40 or 50 yards away in the absolute darkness of the pine forest. The voice was sweet and concerned, exactly the tone a mother might use calling a child home for dinner. It said the name again. Marcus? Honey? Where are you? Marcus had gone absolutely pale, his face drained of color in the firelight. He was shaking. That's my mom's voice, he whispered. That's exactly my mom's voice. Nina moved to position herself between us and the direction of the sound. Your mother's not here, she said, stating the obvious, confirming reality. Whatever that is, it's not your mother. Marcus, the voice called again, closer now. I'm so worried about you. Please come home. Brett had finally gone quiet, his showman confidence evaporating as he registered that something was genuinely wrong. I watched his face cycle through confusion, denial, and the beginning edges of fear. That's got to be someone messing with us, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Some local who saw us drive in. A prank. I wanted to believe that. Every rational part of me was screaming for a logical explanation. Sounds carry strangely in forests. Someone could have heard us talking around the fire. A cruel joke. A hoax. But I'd spent 11 years studying animal behavior, and what I heard in that voice was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The cadence was too perfect. The emotion too precise. It sounded like a recording of a person rather than a person actually speaking, except recordings don't move through the forest, getting closer with each call. Marcus, baby, please. I need you to come to me now. The voice was maybe 30 yards away now. Close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was speaking, but the darkness beyond our firelight was absolute, impenetrable. Nina had her weapon raised, sighting toward the sound. Her hands were steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. This was not a situation she'd trained for. None of us had. Everyone get behind the fire, I said, falling back on the one piece of wilderness logic that seemed applicable. Fire scares predators. We stay in the light. We clustered together, the flames between us and the eastern tree line. Brett was fumbling with his phone, trying to get a signal that didn't exist this far from civilization. Marcus was crying silently, tears streaming down his face as his mother's voice continued to call for him. Nina maintained her firing stance, a stone in the chaos. And I was scanning the darkness, straining my eyes for any shape, any movement, any proof that we were dealing with something explainable. The voice stopped mid-word, cutting off like someone had pressed a mute button. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, the firelight creating shadows that looked like movement. But shadows don't have mass. Shadows don't disturb branches as they pass. And shadows definitely don't have eyes that catch the light like amberstones, reflecting our fire from 15 feet off the ground. Holy shit! Brett breathed, and for once, his words captured the moment perfectly. It emerged from the tree line slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of a creature that has never been anything but the apex predator. Marcus's description had been accurate, horrifyingly, impossibly accurate, but seeing the thing in the flesh was something else entirely. It stood on two legs like a man, but the proportions were wrong in ways that made my brain hurt trying to process. Its torso was too long, its arms hanging past where its knees should have been, and those arms ended in hands, actual hands, with fingers and thumbs, but the fingers were each 8 or 9 inches long, tipped with nails like black thorns. Its body was covered in coarse fur the color of rotting leaves, patchy in places where I could see gray skin stretched over muscle. And its face. I have a master's degree in wildlife biology. I've studied canid skulls. I know exactly how a wolf's face is supposed to be structured, the precise angles of muzzle and brow and orbital socket. This face had started with those blueprints, and then been redesigned by something that didn't understand the rules. The muzzle was too long, extending almost foot beyond where it should have stopped, lined with teeth that overlapped and jutted in irregular rows. The eyes were set too wide, positioned almost on the sides of the head, giving it a field of vision that must have approached 300 degrees. And those eyes, God, those eyes, they held intelligence. Not animal intelligence, the simple calculation of predator assessing prey. This was something else. Something that understood what we were feeling as we looked at it. Something that enjoyed it. Nina fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the sound shattering the frozen moment. I saw the creature jerk as at least one round found its mark, a spray of dark fluid erupting from its shoulder. But it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It tilted its head to one side, studying Nina with what I can only describe as curiosity, and then it opened its mouth and made a sound. The sound was my voice. "Nina, don't shoot," it said, using my exact intonation, my exact rhythm. "It's just a bear. Put the gun down." I felt my sanity buckle. Hearing your own voice coming from something that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be able to speak, shouldn't know your name, it breaks something fundamental in your understanding of reality. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire, and Brett caught me by the arm. His grip was too tight, driven by panic, and later I would find bruises where his fingers had pressed into my flesh. The creature took another step forward, then stopped. It was testing us, I realized. Gauging our reactions. Seeing what we would do. "Everyone run," Nina said, her voice steady despite what we'd just witnessed. "Run for the truck." Now. We ran. The next few minutes exist in my memory as a series of fragmented images, a nightmare slideshow shuffled out of order. The firelit clearing vanishing behind us. Pine branches whipping at my face, drawing blood I didn't feel. Brett screaming about his keys, patting his pockets without finding them. The Land Rover materializing out of the darkness, its chrome accents reflecting the distant glow of our abandoned campfire. Nina shoving me toward the vehicle, taking position behind us, firing twice more into the darkness at something I couldn't see but could hear, branches snapping, undergrowth parting. A heavy body moving through the forest faster than anything that size should be able to move. Brett finally found his keys. They'd been in his jacket all along, right where they should have been, and I heard the chirp of the Land Rover's locks disengaging. We piled inside, all 4 of us, and Brett jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing happened. He turned it again. The engine made no sound. No click, no grinding starter, nothing. The dashboard remained dark. The headlights stayed off. The vehicle sat silent and dead, $100,000 of British engineering reduced to a metal coffin. "It was fine when we got here," Brett was saying, his voice rising toward hysteria. "It was running fine. There's nothing wrong with it, there's nothing, quiet." Nina was scanning the tree line through the windows. Her weapon was reloaded, ready. "It doesn't matter why the car won't start. What matters is we're not in the car." I understood what she meant. The Land Rover had seemed like safety, but in reality it was a trap. We were boxed in, our visibility limited, our mobility 0. If the creature wanted us, we'd be caught inside a container of our own choosing, unable to run, unable to fight effectively. Through the rear window, I could see the glow of our campfire in the distance still burning. And in the flickering light, I could see a shape moving across the clearing. Upright. Unhurried. Coming toward us. "Out of the car," I said. "Back to the fire. Fire's our only advantage." Brett laughed, a high unhinged sound. "You want to go back out there? With that thing?" "The fire didn't go out," I said, my mind racing through survival calculus. "Fire is threat. Fire is unpredictable. Whatever that thing is, it respects the fire enough not to charge straight through it. And we can see in the firelight. Out here in the dark, it has every advantage." Nina nodded. "She's right. Move fast, stay together. I'll take rear position." Marcus was catatonic, unresponsive when I grabbed his arm. Brett had to physically drag him from the vehicle, and we moved in a tight cluster back toward the clearing, back toward the only light source we had in this impossible night. The creature had vanished again. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, and somehow that was worse than watching it approach. At least when I could see it, I knew where danger was located. We made it back to the fire without incident, which felt wrong. Too easy. The flames had died down but were still burning, and I immediately began feeding them more fuel from the woodpile we'd gathered earlier. My hands were shaking, making me clumsy, but I managed to get the fire built up to a proper blaze. In its light, I could see all our abandoned equipment, cameras, tents, coolers, everything we'd brought for our foolish expedition into cryptid hunting. The old deer stand loomed at the eastern edge of the clearing, a wooden platform about 20 feet up in the massive oak. I found myself staring at it, an idea forming in my panic-clouded mind. "We need to get off the ground," I said. "That deer stand. Elevated position, limited approach vectors, better visibility. If we're up there with the fire between us and the tree line, we can see anything coming." "And if it can climb?" Brett asked. "Then we're no worse off than we are down here." Nina was already moving toward the oak, assessing the ladder rungs nailed into its trunk. The deer stand was old but looked solid, built by someone who knew what they were doing. She tested the first rung with her weight. It held. "It'll support us," she said. "Move." We climbed. Marcus first, hauled up by Nina, who'd ascended with the easy physicality of someone who maintained her fitness. Then Brett, then me. The platform was maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, designed for 2 hunters at most, and with 4 of us crowded onto it, there was barely room to move. But we were 20 feet up, surrounded by a railing of 2x4s, and from this vantage, I could see the entire clearing spread out below us. The fire blazed at its center. Our tents formed colorful nylon shapes at the southern edge. And beyond the perimeter of firelight, the forest pressed in like a living wall. For a long moment, nothing happened. We huddled on the platform, catching our breath, trying to process what we'd witnessed. Nina kept her weapon trained on the tree line, sweeping methodically back and forth. Brett was muttering to himself, strings of profanity and denial that I tried to tune out. Marcus had stopped crying but had retreated into some internal space, his eyes focused on nothing. I was the first to see the creature again, and I almost missed it because I was looking in the wrong place. I'd been scanning the tree line, expecting the thing to emerge from the forest like it had before. Instead, when I spotted it, it was already inside the clearing, standing motionless beside our campfire. In the bright light, its details were even more terrible. It was looking up at the deer stand. It was looking directly at me. And then it spoke. "Delia," it said, using Nina's voice this time. "Come down. There's been a misunderstanding. It's safe now." Nina sucked in a sharp breath beside me. Hearing your own voice stolen and used against you, I already knew how that felt, and watching Nina experience it was almost as bad as experiencing it myself. The creature tilted its head, waiting for a response, and when none came, it tried again. "Delia." Brett's voice this time, but lower, calmer than the real Brett had ever sounded. "The cameras are still rolling. Think about the footage. Think about what this means for your career. Come down and let's document this properly." That was when I understood what we were dealing with. Not just a predator that happened to have impossible abilities, but something that studied its prey. It had been listening to us around the campfire. It had heard our conversations, learned our names, picked up on the dynamics of our group. It was using that information now, tailoring its approach based on what it thought would work on each of us. This was not animal behavior. This was something far worse. I found my voice, surprising myself with its steadiness. "We're not coming down." The creature went still. For a long moment, it simply stared up at us, its misaligned eyes reflecting the firelight. Then it moved, and the movement was so fast that I barely tracked it. One moment it was by the fire. The next moment it was at the base of the oak, its 2 long arms reaching up toward the lowest ladder rung. It began to climb. Nina opened fire immediately, squeezing off rounds as fast as she could aim. I saw impacts, dark spatters against the thing's fur, its body jerking with each hit, but it didn't slow down. The bullets were hurting it, I was certain of that, but they weren't stopping it. It ascended the ladder with a horrible deliberate pace, using those elongated fingers to grip the rungs, and each upward movement brought it closer to our platform. "Knife," I said, remembering the hunting knife in my belt, a 7-inch blade I carried for fieldwork. "Cut the ladder rungs." "Cut them." I don't remember drawing the knife. I don't remember the specific motions. But I remember the sensation of sawing frantically at old rope bindings, the ladder rungs connected to the tree by decade-old lashings that had grown brittle with age. Nina was reloading, Brett was screaming, Marcus was praying in Korean, and I was cutting. The rope parted. The top 4 feet of ladder swung away from the tree, and I heard the creature make a sound, a vocalization that wasn't any voice it had stolen. A raw shriek of surprise and fury, and then there was a heavy impact below us as it fell. Not 20 feet, because it caught itself partway down, but far enough to buy us seconds. "It's going to find another way up," Nina said, her voice controlled despite the circumstances. "We're trapped up here." She was right. The deer stand had seemed like salvation, but we'd cornered ourselves. There was no other way down, no escape route, nothing except a 20-foot drop to the ground and a creature that would be waiting for us. I looked around frantically, searching for anything that might help, and my eyes landed on the massive oak branches extending outward from the trunk. Most were too thin to support weight, but one, a branch extending toward the southern edge of the clearing, looked thick enough to traverse. "There," I said, pointing. "That branch connects to another tree. We can get out of this oak, climb down somewhere else." Brett looked where I was pointing and laughed, the sound high and unhinged. "You want us to climb across a tree branch 30 feet in the air with that thing hunting us? I want us to not die on this platform when it figures out how to get up here." Below us, the creature had reached the ground. It was circling the oak now, moving in that wrong-jointed lope, looking up at us periodically, testing the tree from different angles. It was problem-solving, I realized. Figuring out how to reach prey that had proven harder to catch than expected. We had minutes at most before it found a solution. Nina made the decision for us. "I'll go first," she said, holstering her weapon. "Test the branch. If it holds me, it'll hold any of you." She was the heaviest of us, and she knew it. She also knew that someone had to take the risk, and she wasn't the type to ask others to do what she wouldn't do herself. Before any of us could argue, she'd swung herself over the platform railing and onto the branch. The oak groaned. Nina froze. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened, and then she began moving again, inching along the branch in a low crouch, her hands gripping smaller branches for balance. I watched the creature below watch her, its head tracking her movement like a wolf tracking a rabbit. It understood what she was doing. It was waiting to see if she would fall. She didn't fall. She reached the junction where the oak branch met the branches of a neighboring pine, tested the transfer point, and then she was on the pine branch, descending, using the thick needle cover for handholds. In less than 2 minutes she was on the ground, on the opposite side of the clearing from the creature, with the fire between them. "Go!" she called up to us, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Marcus next. Hurry!" Getting Marcus to move was like trying to animate a corpse. He'd shut down entirely, his mind retreating from a reality it couldn't process. Brett and I physically lifted him over the railing and onto the branch, and I talked him through every movement, every handhold, my voice steady and calm while internally I was screaming. The creature had stopped circling. It was watching Marcus's progress with that terrible intelligent patience, and I couldn't tell if it was waiting for him to fall or calculating a new approach. Marcus made it to the pine. He descended more by falling than climbing, but Nina was there to catch him, and he didn't break anything. That left me and Brett on the platform, and the creature was moving again, not toward us, but toward the pine where Nina and Marcus stood. It was cutting off our escape route. "Go now," I told Brett. "Right now, before it reaches them." Brett looked at me, and for one moment, his mask of entitlement and confidence dropped entirely. What I saw beneath was a scared young man who never faced genuine danger in his life, who'd built his entire identity on manufactured adventure, and who was realizing that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. "I don't want to die," he said, and it was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. "Then move." He moved. He was faster than Marcus had been, his athletic body responding to adrenaline, and he made the crossing in less than a minute. I watched him reach the pine, watched him descend, watched Nina gesture frantically for me to follow. The creature had stopped at the base of the pine, looking up at the three of them, and I understood that it was waiting for me. It didn't want to kill them while I was watching. It wanted me to come down. It wanted all four of us together before it finished what it had started. I crossed the branch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and halfway across, my foot slipped on a patch of lichen, and for one terrible moment, I was dangling by my arms with nothing beneath me but 30 feet of air and a monster waiting below. I could hear Nina screaming at me to hold on, could hear Brett praying or cursing or both, and I pulled myself back onto the branch with strength I didn't know I had and kept moving. I reached the pine. I descended. And when my feet touched solid ground, Nina grabbed my arm and pulled me into a run. We ran south, toward the road where we'd entered the property, toward civilization and cell signals and the possibility of rescue. The creature didn't chase us immediately. I could hear it behind us, pacing, keeping distance, herding us in the direction we were already going. It wasn't finished with us, but it wasn't attacking either. It was enjoying this, I realized. It was playing with its food. The forest at night is a different world. Branches that were visible in daylight become invisible barriers that tear at your skin and clothes. Roots that were obvious obstacles become leg-breaking traps. We ran as fast as we could, which wasn't very fast, and the sounds behind us never got closer but never got farther away either. Marcus was in the lead, some survival instinct having finally overridden his shutdown, and he was setting a brutal pace that left Brett gasping and me struggling to keep up. We burst out of the tree line onto the dirt road maybe 15 minutes later. It felt like hours, but my watch said 15 minutes, and Nina immediately started looking for landmarks. "The gate," she said. "We came through a gate. There was a farmhouse." "Kowalczyk's place," I said, remembering the old farmer who'd rented us the land. "Half a mile north." "Maybe less." "Then we go north." We went north. The dirt road was easier to traverse than the forest, but it was also more exposed, and I kept looking over my shoulder for any sign of pursuit. The creature had stopped at the tree line. I could see its silhouette against the deeper darkness of the pines, watching us retreat, making no move to follow. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Predators don't let prey escape that easily unless they have a reason. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in the road, lights glowing in 2 downstairs windows. My phone had finally found a signal, 1 bar, flickering, and I was already dialing 911 as we approached the front porch. The call connected. A dispatcher's voice, asking me to state my emergency. And then the front door of the farmhouse opened. An old man Kowalczyk stepped onto the porch with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He looked at us. He looked past us, toward the tree line we'd emerged from. And he made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. I lowered my phone without ending the call. The dispatcher's voice was still audible, tiny and distant, asking if anyone was there. "You knew," I said. "You rented us that land knowing what was out there." Kowalczyk's face twisted with something like guilt, something like grief. "Didn't think you'd actually find it," he said. "Most people camp out here, they don't see nothing. The shunt don't show itself unless..." He stopped. "Unless someone tells the story right. Gives it shape. That's what my grandfather said. The shunt is what you describe it as. You tell the story, you give it form. I thought about Marcus's story around the campfire. The 7-foot frame. The wrong hands. The stolen voices. The teeth. He described the creature in perfect detail, and minutes later, that exact creature had emerged from the forest. "That's not possible," I said, but my voice had no conviction. The thing I'd seen was not possible. Marcus's mother's voice coming from the darkness was not possible. Yet all of it had happened. The dispatcher was still talking. I raised the phone to my ear. "I need to report." I stopped. What was I going to say? That we'd been chased by a cryptid that matched a campfire legend? That we needed police to come fight a creature that had shrugged off gunfire? "I need to report a missing person," I said instead, and then I realized what I'd said, and I turned to count our group. Nina. Marcus. Me. Brett was gone. He'd been with us when we left the forest. I was certain of it. I'd seen him descend from the pine, seen him running behind Marcus as we fled. But somewhere in the darkness between the trees and the farmhouse, Brett Calloway had vanished. Nina was already moving, heading back toward the road, toward the tree line. I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said. "We can't go back out there. I'm not leaving him. He's already gone." I didn't know how I knew this, but I knew it with absolute certainty. The creature had let us go because it had taken what it wanted. It had let us believe we were escaping while it claimed one of us for itself. "If we go back into those woods, we die too." Nina looked at me. I could see the conflict in her face, duty versus survival, guilt versus self-preservation. She was a soldier, trained to never leave anyone behind. But she was also a realist, and she'd seen what we were dealing with. After a long moment, she closed her eyes and let out a breath that sounded like surrender. We didn't find Brett Calloway. The police searched for 3 days, bringing dogs and drones and grid patterns, and they found nothing. No body. No clothing. No sign of struggle. The only evidence that anything had happened was the Land Rover with its inexplicably dead battery, the vehicle that had worked perfectly before we'd set up camp and refused to start when we needed to. Escape. A mechanic examined it later and found nothing wrong. The battery was fully charged. The connections were clean. There was no reason it shouldn't have started. The official report listed Brett as a missing person, presumed to have become disoriented in the forest, and possibly fallen victim to hypothermia or wildlife. Marcus and Nina and I gave statements that were heavily edited, describing a large animal, possibly a bear, that had frightened us into fleeing. We didn't mention the stolen voices. We didn't mention the intelligent eyes or the too long fingers or the impossible speed. We had all wordlessly agreed, in the aftermath, that telling the truth would only make things worse. Marcus stopped talking almost entirely after that night. He finished out the year with Brett's production company, handling final edits on completed projects, and then he disappeared from public life. I heard through mutual contacts that he'd returned to the Upper Peninsula, to that tiny town called Germfask, and that he refused to speak about what had happened. I don't know if he's found any peace. I hope he has. Nina became something like a friend in the months that followed. We met for coffee occasionally, 2 people connected by a trauma no one else would believe. She'd resigned from the corrections service, citing burnout, and was working private security for tech executives in the Madison area. "Easier money," she'd said. "No monsters. At least, not the kind that have claws." She carried 2 weapons now instead of 1, and she never went anywhere without checking the exits first. As for me, I took a leave of absence from the DNR that eventually became permanent. My supervisor was understanding. She'd seen too many field biologists burn out after dangerous encounters, and she assumed I was processing a normal kind of trauma. I didn't correct her. I spent 6 months in a rented cabin near Door County, trying to write down what had happened, trying to make sense of the impossible. The words came slowly, and they never felt adequate. It was during this time that I received the phone call from the man who would not give his name. He knew details he shouldn't have known, the exact time we'd fled the clearing, the precise number of shots Nina had fired, the words the creature had used in its mimicry. He told me that my silence was appreciated, that certain agencies had an interest in keeping reports like mine from entering the public record. He told me that Brett Calloway's family had been given a satisfactory explanation and a settlement that would keep them from asking questions. And he told me, in a voice that was almost gentle, that people who talked about the shunt tended to attract its attention again. "You gave it a story once," he said. "Don't give it another." I asked him what it was. What we'd seen out there in the Pine Barrens. His answer was simple. Something old. Something that exists in the space between what we believe and what is real. When enough people describe it the same way, it becomes what they describe. He paused. "Your friend told a very detailed story. Very accurate." The shunk appreciated that. The call ended. I tried to trace the number afterward, but there was no record of any incoming call on my phone at that time. Just a gap in my log, as if the conversation had never happened. I think about Kowalczyk's words sometimes. The shunk is what you describe it as. You tell the story, you give it form. If that's true, and I'm no longer in a position to dismiss anything as impossible, then every campfire story, every whispered legend, every detailed account of monsters in the woods is potentially an invocation. We think we're telling stories to scare ourselves. Maybe we're actually casting something into existence. I don't tell stories anymore. I don't describe what I saw in any detail to anyone except in this written account, and even now, I've been careful. Vague in places. Inexact in ways that feel like cowardice but might be protection. The man on the phone said attention-seeking attracts the shunk's attention. I'm trying very hard not to seek anything except peace. But peace doesn't come easily when you've seen behind the curtain. When you've heard your own voice coming from a mouth that shouldn't exist. When you've watched a friend disappear into the darkness because you were too slow, too scared, too human to save him. I moved to Arizona 6 months after the incident. Desert. Flat. Nothing like the pine forests of Wisconsin. I told myself it was for a fresh start, a new career opportunity, a chance to rebuild my life in a place without so many memories. But the truth is simpler. I wanted to be somewhere with no trees. Somewhere I could see the horizon in every direction. Somewhere nothing could hide. It mostly worked. The nightmares faded from nightly to weekly to monthly. The hypervigilance eased. I found a job with a reptile conservation nonprofit, studying Gila monsters and desert tortoises, creatures that operated on simple biological principles. That didn't steal voices or climb trees or show impossible intelligence. I'd built a small life in a small adobe house on the outskirts of Tucson, and I tried very hard to convince myself that what happened in Wisconsin was an isolated incident. A localized horror that couldn't follow me across 2,000 miles of highway. Then I heard the voice. It was 3 weeks ago. I was walking my dog, a rescue Australian shepherd named Luna, along a desert trail near my house. The sun was setting, painting the saguaros in shades of orange and red, and I was thinking about nothing more complicated than what I'd make for dinner. Luna stopped suddenly, her ears pricking forward, her hackles rising along her spine. I followed her gaze toward a cluster of creosote bushes about 50 yards off the trail. And from the bushes, I heard Brett Calloway's voice. "Delia," he said. "I'm so glad I found you. I've been looking for so long." I grabbed Luna and ran. I ran all the way back to my house and locked every door and closed every blind and sat in the center of my living room with a hunting rifle across my lap until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat there, listening, waiting for a voice that never came again. But I know it will. I know the shunk followed me, or more accurately, I know that my memory of it, my constant circling thoughts about that night, my inability to stop telling myself the story, has been drawing it toward me this whole time. The man on the phone was right. Attention attracts it. Thinking about it attracts it. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for nearly 2 years. So I'm writing this down now. All of it. Every detail I can remember. Not because I want attention, but because someone needs to understand. The Wisconsin Dogman. The skunk. The thing that wears the wrong skin. It's not a hoax. It's not a misidentification. It's something that exists in the space between storytelling and reality, and it feeds on being described. I'm going to leave this account somewhere it might be found. And then I'm going to stop running. I've been running for 2 years, and it hasn't helped. Maybe facing the thing is the only way to end this. Maybe giving it one final story, a story where I'm not prey, where I'm not fleeing, where I'm standing my ground, will change the outcome. Or maybe I'll disappear like Brett did, and no one will ever know what happened. Either way, the story ends here. Last night I built a campfire in my backyard. I sat beside it, and I watched the darkness beyond the flames, and I waited. And from somewhere in the desert, from the direction of those creosote bushes where I'd heard Brett's voice, I saw 2 amber points of light. Eyes. Watching. Patient. It knows I'm ready. It's been waiting for me to stop running. And tonight, when the sun sets, I'm going to walk out into the desert and meet it. This is Delia Vance. I was a wildlife biologist who didn't believe in monsters. And now I'm going to become part of a story that will outlive me, a story that someone will tell around a campfire someday, describing a creature in just enough detail to bring it back into the world. The cycle continues. I hope you never have to see what I've seen. But if you do, if you're sitting around a fire and someone starts describing the dogman, the skunk, the thing that wears the wrong skin, stop them. Stop them before the description becomes too accurate. Stop them before they give it form. Because it's listening. It's always listening. And it's very, very patient. The sun painted the Sonoran desert in shades of blood and copper as I made my final preparations. I'd spent the day putting my affairs in order, not because I expected to die, but because I'd learned in Wisconsin that expectations meant nothing when dealing with the skunk. My will was updated, naming my sister in Portland as beneficiary. Luna had been dropped at my neighbor's house with a month's worth of food and a note explaining that I might be gone for a while. The neighbor, an elderly retired teacher named Dolores, had looked at me with concern but hadn't asked questions. I think she saw something in my eyes that told her questions wouldn't help. I dressed practically: hiking boots, cargo pants, a long-sleeved shirt to protect against the evening chill that descends on the desert once the sun disappears. I strapped my hunting knife to my belt, the same knife that had saved us in Wisconsin, the blade that had cut the ladder rungs and bought us precious seconds. I considered bringing a gun but decided against it. Nina had emptied half a magazine into the creature, and it had barely slowed. Bullets weren't the answer. I needed something else. The campfire in my backyard had burned down to embers, but I rebuilt it before I left, feeding it mesquite wood until the flames climbed high and bright. A beacon. A signal. If the skunk was watching, and I knew it was, I wanted it to know I wasn't hiding anymore. I walked into the desert as twilight settled over the landscape. The trail I followed was one I'd walked dozens of times during my months in Arizona, a winding path through saguaros and ocotillo that eventually led to a dry wash about 2 miles from my property. The wash was where I'd heard Brett's voice 3 weeks ago, and something told me it was where the creature wanted me to go. I moved at a steady pace, not hurrying, not hesitating. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. That felt important. The last light faded as I reached the wash. The dry riverbed stretched before me, lined with pale sand and scattered boulders that cast long shadows in the rising moonlight. The moon was nearly full tonight. I'd checked before leaving, and it provided enough illumination to see clearly without artificial light. I didn't want to carry a flashlight. Flashlights create circles of visibility surrounded by deeper darkness. I wanted to see everything, even if everything could see me too. I stopped in the center of the wash and waited. The desert at night is never truly silent. There's always the rustle of small creatures, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through dry vegetation. But as I stood there, those sounds began to fade, replaced by the same unnatural quiet I'd experienced in Wisconsin. The absence of life. The holding of breath. The acknowledgement that something apex had entered the territory. "I know you're here," I said aloud. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, too human, too small. "I'm done running. Whatever happens tonight, it ends here." For a long moment, nothing responded. I began to wonder if I'd imagined everything, if the stress of the past 2 years had finally broken something in my mind that couldn't be repaired. Then I heard movement in the creosote bushes to my left, and a voice emerged from the darkness. My voice. "Delia," it said, using my own intonation, my own rhythm. "You've been so brave. But you don't have to do this. You can still go home." I turned toward the sound. The creature emerged from the brush slowly, deliberately, just as it had in Wisconsin. The moonlight caught its form, and I saw that it had changed, or perhaps it had always been capable of changing, adapting its appearance to match its environment. The fur that had been the color of dead leaves was now the tawny shade of desert sand. Its proportions seemed slightly different too, the limbs more elongated, the posture more suited to a landscape of open spaces rather than dense forest. But the eyes were the same. Those amber eyes, reflecting moonlight like a cat's, holding intelligence that no animal should possess. "You're still using my voice," I said. "After all this time, you haven't learned anyone new?" The creature tilted its head, that gesture I remembered, curious and predatory. When it spoke again, it used Nina's voice. "I've learned many voices. Hundreds. Thousands. But yours is special, Delia. You gave me such a perfect story. Such detailed description. I wanted to thank you. That was Marcus's story. Not mine." Marcus spoke the words. The creature took a step closer, and I forced myself not to retreat. "But you listened. You imagined. You believed, even when you told yourself you didn't. That's what gives me form. Not the telling, the believing. I thought about that. About all the hours I'd spent replaying that night in my mind, visualizing the creature, trying to understand what I'd seen. Every time I'd remembered it, I'd been reinforcing it. Making it more real. More solid. More capable of following me across 2,000 miles. "Then I'll stop believing," I said. "I'll stop thinking about you. I'll forget you ever existed." The creature laughed, a horrible sound, my own laugh distorted and stretched into something inhuman. "You can't forget me, Delia. I'm part of you now. Every time you close your eyes, you see me. Every time you hear a strange sound in the night, you think of me. You've spent 2 years making me stronger. Why would you stop now?" It was right. I knew it was right. The obsession had become pathological, a feedback loop I couldn't escape. The more I tried not to think about the shunk, the more I thought about it. The more I thought about it, the more power I gave it. I was trapped in a prison of my own consciousness. But I hadn't come here unprepared. "You're right," I said. "I can't forget you. I've tried, and it doesn't work. But I've figured out something else. Something your kind probably doesn't want people to understand." The creature went still. Its head tilted to the other side, a mirror of its earlier gesture. "What have you figured out, Delia? You said the telling doesn't give you form, the believing does. That's why you let us go in Wisconsin. You could have killed all of us, but you only took Brett. Because you needed survivors. You needed people who would remember you, think about you, tell stories about you. Dead people can't believe. Dead people can't spread the legend." The creature didn't respond, but something in its posture shifted. A tension that hadn't been there before. "That's why you followed me instead of Marcus or Nina," I continued. "Marcus shut down. He stopped thinking, stopped processing. He's probably the safest of all of us because his mind won't let him remember. Nina compartmentalized. She's practical, focused on the present, not dwelling on what she can't control. But me? I laughed, and it sounded almost as wrong as the creature's laugh had. "I'm a scientist," I analyze. I document. I replay and examine and try to understand. I've been feeding you for 2 years without even realizing it. You understand more than most. The creature said, using a voice I didn't recognize, male, elderly, with an accent I couldn't place. That makes you valuable. It makes me dangerous, I corrected. Because now I understand the rules. And rules can be exploited. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the object I'd brought with me, a small leather journal, worn and filled with handwriting. I held it up so the creature could see it clearly in the moonlight. Do you know what this is? It's the journal of Heinrich Kowalczyk, the grandfather of the man who rented us that campsite. I tracked down his family, convinced them I was writing a book about local legends. It took months, but they eventually let me photograph the pages. I opened the journal to a marked section. Heinrich was fascinated by the skunk. He spent 40 years documenting everything he could learn about it. Interviews with native elders, stories passed down through European immigrant families, records from the logging camps that used to operate in those forests. And he discovered something interesting. The creature had stopped moving entirely. Its eyes were fixed on the journal with an intensity that told me I'd found something that mattered. The skunk isn't eternal, I said, reading from the pages. It exists in cycles. When belief is strong, it manifests. When belief fades, it sleeps. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes for centuries. Heinrich tracked 4 major manifestation periods going back to the 1600s, and in every case, the cycle ended the same way. I looked up from the journal and met those amber eyes. Someone stopped believing. Not by trying to forget, that doesn't work, as you pointed out. But by believing in something else more strongly. By replacing the fear with a different story. That's not possible, the creature said, but there was something in its voice, uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Belief isn't a choice. You can't decide what terrifies you. No, I agreed. But I can decide what I focus on. And I've spent the last 3 weeks preparing a new story. A better story. One that's going to replace you in my mind until there's no room left for the skunk. I closed the journal and tucked it back into my pocket. Then I took a deep breath and began to speak. There was once a woman named Delia who walked into the desert to face her fears. She was tired and sad and had been running for too long, but she had finally understood something important, that monsters only have the power we give them. The thing she faced in the desert was old, and it was clever, but it was also hungry, so hungry for attention, for belief, for the emotional energy of human fear. And Delia realized that hunger was a weakness. Because something that needs so desperately to be seen, to be believed in, to be remembered, that thing is dependent. It can't exist without us. And if we choose to stop feeding it, it starves. The creature made a sound, something between a growl and a whimper. It took a step backward, and I saw its form flicker, like a television losing signal. The woman in the desert wasn't afraid anymore. I continued, my voice growing stronger. She looked at the thing that had been haunting her, and she saw it for what it really was, a parasite. A story that had learned to feed on other stories. It had no substance of its own. No reality beyond what frightened minds gave it. And she decided, standing there in the moonlight, that she was done being food. The creature's form flickered again. Its outline was becoming less distinct, the details I'd been imagining for 2 years starting to blur and fade. She walked toward the creature, and it tried to stop her with stolen voices, with threats, with memories of the people it had taken. But she kept walking. Because she had a new story now, a story about a woman who was brave, who faced the darkness and refused to blink, who took back the power she'd been giving away. And that story was stronger. That story was hers. I walked toward the creature. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop, to run, to flee from the predator that had killed Brett, and would surely kill me. But I kept walking. And with each step, the creature's form grew less substantial. The amber eyes dimmed. The 2 long fingers shortened. The impossible anatomy began to collapse in on itself like a structure losing its foundation. "You can't do this," it said, and now its voice was a chorus of all the voices it had stolen: Brett and Marcus's mother, and Nina and me and dozens of others, all speaking at once in a desperate cacophony. "We're connected. I'm part of you. You can't just watch me," I said. I reached the spot where the creature had been standing. There was nothing there now but moonlight and sand and the faint smell of something burning. The desert sounds were returning: coyotes in the distance, insects in the brush, the soft whisper of wind through saguaro needles. Life was flowing back into the space the shunk had occupied. I stood there for a long time, breathing, waiting, listening for any sign that it wasn't really gone. But the silence that surrounded me now was natural silence, the comfortable quiet of a desert night, not the suffocating absence of a predator's presence. Eventually, I walked home. That was 6 months ago. I'm writing this final section as an addendum to the account I prepared before that night, the account you've been reading. I want to be clear about what happened and what it means. The shunk isn't dead. I don't think something like that can truly die. But it's sleeping now, starved into dormancy by my refusal to keep feeding it. Heinrich Kowalczyk's journal described similar periods of dormancy lasting anywhere from 30 to 200 years. Long enough for the original believers to die, for the stories to fade into folklore, for new generations to dismiss the legends as superstition. I've been careful since that night. I don't dwell on the memories. When thoughts of Wisconsin surface, as they sometimes do, I redirect my attention to the present, to my work, to the life I'm building in the desert. I've started a new research project studying kit fox behavior in the Sonoran ecosystem, and I find that focusing on real animals, observable patterns, documented science, helps crowd out the space where the shunk used to live. Nina calls me once a month. She's doing better too. She said she had her own confrontation with the thing about 4 months after mine. It showed up outside her apartment in Madison, calling to her in the voices of people she'd served with in Afghanistan. She did something similar to what I did, though her version was more martial. She told me she stood in her doorway and very calmly informed the creature that she'd faced scarier things in Kandahar, that it was welcome to try its luck against a combat veteran with 8 years of hand-to-hand training, and that if it ever showed up again, she'd find a way to hurt it that it wouldn't recover from. She said it flickered and faded just like mine had. "Turns out," she told me, "the thing can't handle it when we're not scared. Fear is its food. Take that away, and it's just a bad memory with delusions of grandeur." Marcus remains unreachable. I've tried to contact him through various channels, but he's disappeared entirely. No social media, no forwarding address, nothing. Part of me worries that the shunk found him, that his retreat into silence wasn't protection but vulnerability. But another part of me hopes he found his own way to peace. Maybe returning to the Upper Peninsula, to the land where his grandfather first learned the stories, gave him a different relationship with the creature. Maybe for some people, the only escape is geographic. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he's okay. But I've accepted that I might never know. The Calloway family never got their son back. The settlement the mysterious caller mentioned apparently went through. I heard from a journalist contact that Brett's parents received a substantial payment from an insurance company and subsequently dropped all demands for further investigation. Brett Calloway was officially declared dead 8 months ago, the victim of misadventure in a wilderness area. His YouTube channel was memorialized by his production company, and occasionally I see clips from old episodes surface on social media, this grinning young man pretending to be braver than he was. I try not to watch them. Brett wasn't a good person, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. As for the journal, Heinrich Kowalczyk's documentation of the shunk, I've kept it. I go back and forth on what to do with it. Part of me thinks it should be published, made available to anyone who might encounter something similar. But another part worries that spreading the knowledge would just create more believers, more people imagining the creature in enough detail to give it form. Heinrich himself seemed to struggle with this dilemma. His final entries, written in 1972 just before his death, include a passage that I've memorized. The shunk exists because we speak of it. And we speak of it because it exists. Breaking this circle is the only way to be free. But breaking the circle requires understanding it first, and understanding it requires speaking of it. This is the trap. This is why the thing will never truly end. The best we can do is teach our children to tell different stories. Stories about human courage, about facing darkness, about refusing to let fear consume us. Perhaps, in a generation or two, those will be the stories that have power. Perhaps our descendants will be braver than we were. I think about those words often. I think about what kind of stories we tell ourselves, as a culture, about the things that scare us. We love our monsters. We make movies about them, write books about them, gather around campfires and try to scare each other with descriptions of creatures that lurk in the dark. It's human nature. We need our fears externalized, given form, made into something we can imagine fighting. But what if that impulse is exactly what things like the shunk exploit? What if our love of horror stories is feeding something we don't understand? What if every creepypasta, every found footage film, every viral thread about cryptids and demons and things that shouldn't exist is actually an act of creation, bringing into being the very horrors we're describing? I don't have answers. I only have my experience, and my hope that sharing it might help someone else survive a similar encounter. If you take nothing else from this account, take this: belief is power. The stories we tell shape the world we live in. If you find yourself facing something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, remember that its existence depends on you. Refuse to be afraid. Refuse to feed it. Tell yourself a different story, a story where you're the hero, where courage matters, where the monster is just a shadow that dissolves in the light of human determination. I've stopped going to campfires. I don't tell scary stories anymore. When someone starts describing a creature they claim to have seen, a dogman, a skinwalker, a thing that wears the wrong skin, I change the subject or walk away. Not because I'm afraid of triggering myself, but because I know now that those descriptions might be more dangerous than we realize. The last thing I want to tell you is this: last week, I received a postcard with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in Wisconsin I'd never heard of, a place called Spirit Falls. The postcard was blank except for a single sentence, written in cramped handwriting that looked very old. It sleeps, but it dreams of you. I burned the postcard. I refused to give those words power. I refused to let them settle into my mind and take root. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't slept badly since then. If I said I hadn't checked my locks twice before bed. If I said I hadn't caught myself, in quiet moments, imagining amber eyes watching from the darkness. The cycle continues. It always continues. But so do we. And as long as we're brave enough to tell ourselves the right stories, stories of survival, of courage, of humans who face the darkness and choose not to blink, we have a chance. This is Delia Vance, signing off. If you've read this far, thank you. And remember, the shunk, or whatever you call it where you live, is only as strong as your fear of it. Don't be afraid. Tell yourself a better story. And whatever you do, don't describe the thing too accurately around the campfire. It's still listening. It's always listening. But now, at least, you know how to make it stop.